What are you thinking? How do you feel?
This is my boomstick!
It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
Arguably the precipice of the Giallo genre, 1987's opera directed by Dario Argento enchants audiences with a resplendent rendition of Macbeth. Argento bases the movie on his own experiences after directing a failed production of Verdi's Macbeth. Argento sought to make opera his redemption film and shot a large majority of opera in the very real theatre, Teatro Regio di Parma. The chandelier of the massive theatre was removed and replaced with a massive rig for Argento's camera, allowing him to freely capture a bird's-eye view of Teatro Italiano. Scenes from the film evoke memories of The Sound of Music, and most obviously, The Phantom of the Opera. When the female lead of the production, Mara, is struck by a car outside of the theatre, our protagonist, Betty, is given the role of Lady Macbeth and the opportunity of a lifetime. One could make the connection between Betty and Dario's real-life daughter, Dario Argento, who would be about 12 years old during the filming of opera, but had already started an acting career at the youthful age of 9. When we are initially introduced to Betty, she is portrayed in an adolescent manner, laid on a bed listening to music in a room decorated with movies, books, ornaments of animals, and a fairy statue. A pink bunny cuddles her on her bed. After receiving an ominous phone call informing her of her new role as Lady Macbeth, Betty nervously tosses her head, breathing excitedly and biting her nails. We are left unsure whether the panic that ensues is caused by the call itself or the news of her starring role in Macbeth. Accepting the role not only challenges Betty's preconceived notions of her performing abilities, but also her personal perception. The difference between her personal wavering confidence and the strong, ambitious, and ruthless character of Lady Macbeth. Betty enters a world in which an older generation of women already dominate. The 4 women act as an impending preview of Betty's eventual outcome if she decides to follow not only their footsteps, but those of her mother as well. In a flashback, we are shown Betty's mother in a black dress and beige cardigan. Betty is shown nearby, with a similar outfit and hairstyle compared to her mother. This acts as a representation that Betty's life is created in her mother's image, and to this point, Betty has in fact followed in her mother's footsteps, as Betty's mother was also a theatre actress. Betty will continually be confronted with the similarities to her mother, and ultimately be challenged in the climax to continue in her mother's image, or diverge from the predetermined path. Consistent with many of Argento's films, it isn't the who that makes Betty's character important, but rather the why. A recurring theme throughout opera is a lack of intimacy and sexuality. First, we see a flashback from the killer's point of view. He exposes Betty's mother while she sleeps, and we see glimpses of her hands being bound together, in a manner that makes it appear as though she is a willing participant. Later in the film, Betty is shown apologizing for being unable to reach orgasm, proclaiming herself to be a disaster in bed. The sexual discordance throughout the films may have been influenced by the real-life drama between Argento and actress Daria Nicolodi, who had recently ended their long-term relationship. Daria was hesitant to act in the film, but was finally convinced by the elaborate death her character succumbs to. Outside of the film, the real world was just starting to cope with the AIDS epidemic, which was being broadcast on television, and misinformation about how the disease was spread still ran rampant. Actor Ian Charleson, who plays the film's male love interest Marco, was diagnosed with HIV during the filming of opera and sadly passed away a few years later. Uncovered during the plot of the film, we learn the mysterious killer had a relationship with Betty's mother. Mirroring Lady Macbeth's relationship with Macbeth, Betty's mother convinces, and maybe even manipulates her lover into committing violent acts for her depraved pleasure. The killer sees Betty as the spitting image of her mother, a perception Betty now struggles with internally. He is convinced so thoroughly he even proclaims,
You finally returned.
The killer views Betty as a chance to redeem his failed sexual relationship with her mother and attempts to win over her affection by performing for her the only thing he has associated with love so far: barbaric acts of violence. Argento famously used shots of eyes in his films, convinced the windows to the soul could outperform any spoken dialogue. Arguably, every scene of this film centers itself around them. The film opens with the eyes of a crow, a species infamous for its intelligence and memory. There is a saying, "Never cross a crow, it will remember your face forever." We only see two characters cross the crows, and both are met with misfortune. Mara, who is self-centered and views herself as the most important person in the room, is introduced with a point-of-view shot, a metaphor for her lack of empathy or care for others, never viewing her actions from someone else's perspective. Mara is hit by the car and loses the role of Lady Macbeth, and the killer, who is revealed to be Santini, is attacked by the crows, losing his eye when they are used to identify the killer in the final act. Santini's murders are committed while Betty is tied up and forced to witness the violence or have her eyes stabbed with needles. The idea for this twisted torture method derived from a joke Argento told about critics and audiences who would turn away and hide their eyes during scary scenes of his films. When Betty and Mira are trapped in an apartment, Mira uses the peephole to communicate with the man outside the front door. The man turns out to be Santini, who shoots a fatal bullet through the peephole, entering Mira's eye and killing her instantly. Santini coerces Betty into shooting him as he ignites the room they're locked within. In this scene, Betty is blindfolded, which may be a purposeful admission that this final act of violence was only a deception. Revealed in the films moments later is that fact that Santini uses a mannequin to fake his own death. In the final moments of the film's conclusion, Santini is knocked down by Betty when he takes his eyes off of her for a few seconds. Santini's inability to see Betty as an individual rather than a reflection of her mother is his ultimate undoing. Betty is finally able to see clearly that she can denounce the perverted life of her mother and forge her own
Not
path.
true! I'm not like my mother! Nothing like it! Nothing at all! Nothing at all!
Despite her recent trauma and personal growth, Betty did not lose sight of who she is and wants to be as a person, and overcomes the pressure of the influences around her. Opera truly is a multi-layered visual spectacle. Despite the heavy themes we covered in this video, it doesn't even scratch the surface of innuendo. Themes of traditional matriarchy, juxtaposition with the Macbeth story, childhood fragility, and European fashion of the era are just some of the controversial topics opera digs its heels into. Perhaps the best way to digest and understand the relevant subtexts of the film is by doing exactly what Argento wanted his audience to do. Sit back, open their eyes, and watch his film magistrale. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to get notified when the next love letter to a cinema classic drops. Check out Dread and Terror on Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon to show support. We love you all so much, it's scary.